South Vietnam is a land of villages. The villagers are the prize in a 30-year struggle for hearts and minds. Friendship for one side brings destruction from the other. The U.S. wins the village war, but loses South Vietnam. Between 1965-68, America commits 500,000 troops to Vietnam. The main strategy is to search out communist forces and destroy them. But many policymakers say the war should be fought politically, not militarily. Former CIA Director William Colby.
As the tension level grew in Vietnam, the tendency was to strengthen the military forces against the prospect of an attack by North Vietnam. Now here I think the Americans made a fundamental error that pursued us all the way through Vietnam, because we said that if there's a war going on, it must be an affair for soldiers. And we consequently thought of building up the military response to a war.
1960. William Colby becomes CIA chief in Saigon. He helps the government develop a program of rural self-defense. The fortified villages get weapons from the CIA and militia training from U.S. Special Forces advisors. They are called strategic hamlets. The program to secure the villages is called pacification. But few villages resist the guerrilla attacks. In 1962, the late French historian Bernard Fall records the escalating war.
This is the village of My Thuy, which is a small village not too far from Saigon, at the edge of the Mekong Delta. It's probably got 2,000 inhabitants, like most of the small villages in Vietnam. There are about 12,000 such units in this country. And its population is mostly Buddhist.
To the Vietnamese peasant, the war means a total disturbance of his way of life. He's being shelled by one side or bombed, or he's being resettled in villages. He's been very often resettled 3 or 4 times in different villages. He's being taxed by both sides, and now the communist taxes are extremely heavy. The communist taxes now run about 10 times the government taxes. The peasant doesn't go for ideology, the peasant goes for social justice. He wants his piece of land, and he wants a fair taxation system. He doesn't want to be robbed by the army. Neither does he want, by the way, to be tortured by the VC. He wants to be basically left alone.
The guerrillas, called the National Liberation Front, use selective execution as the first stage of taking over a village. They allegedly killed 37,000 people during the war years. Journalist Tan Tat Tien.
In my own village, they killed about 90 people. And many of these had nothing to do with politics or anything. They were simple farmers or workers, but they were articulate, and they could provide leadership, and they had to be got rid of.
Anti-communist Vietnamese call the guerrillas Viet Cong, or VC. Soldiers call them Charlie.
Charlie. He had a habit. It was a good habit because it worked. He'd come in one night, find out who's in charge, go to them and say, listen, tomorrow morning we're coming back. We want so much food and we want so many men. And if you don't give them to us, it might be bad on you. And they take everything. Everything they could get their hands on. Food, gold, silver, anything that was in the town.
Having killed or intimidated village leaders, the rebels settle in the village. Some stay for years. Land reform is the next stage. The land is now equally divided among the peasant farmers. Using traditional communist methods, the guerrillas set out to build a strong political organization. Every villager must join a political group. Peasants are gradually retrained as cadres, or political leaders of farmers, women, and youths. The communists encourage group self-criticism. They appeal to nationalism, instilling hatred of the old order and of the white Americans in Vietnam. They are widely successful. In 1965, the Central Intelligence Agency draws a political map. It shows 50% of the countryside is under some degree of communist control. The U.S. sends combat troops. For the Saigon government, the battle for the villages is the most important front of the war. President Nguyen Van Thieu.
The whole thing consisted that how to recapture the people from the hand of Viet Cong, the communist, and to promote, to help them to promote a better life. So I think the better life and the prosperity in the countryside, which compose 95% of the people in the country, is the best weapon against communists.
1965. Village operations combine military and psychological tactics. Vietnamese troops and American advisors surround the area. The villagers are told that friendly people have nothing to fear. The soldiers evacuate the village, then search it. If there is evidence of communist activity, the village is considered a military base and is usually destroyed. Press critics see pacification as cruelty to civilians. The U.S. commander, General William Westmoreland, says that picture is distorted.
As one who has fought in 3 wars, I can say categorically that never in the history of warfare, certainly never in the history of the use of American arms, have more attention been given to the avoidance of civilian casualties than we did in Vietnam. There was a famous case of burning a village by the Marines outside of Da Nang. But that village had been a place where the enemy was harbored by the local population. But before those villages were burned, the people living in those villages were humanely relocated, which was the general practice.
By 1967, communist captives number 17,000, but civilian refugees number 1.25 million. Villages are destroyed to deny use by the communists. Combat in the villages is seen as counterproductive by many Vietnamese. General Tran Van Dam.
If there were some enemies in one village, they used the American way to very far power, to destroy the village because there were some enemies inside, and after that to occupy the village. But for me, for us, it was not a good way. If we destroy the village, we destroy the people too.
Helicopter gunships now routinely attack communist-controlled villages. The communists portray pacification as brutal war on a helpless population. Although Saigon controls the politics, Americans control the firepower and are blamed. A soldier recalls.
The thing that stands out in my mind more than anything else was I saw a woman looking at me with an expression of hate, of pure, unadulterated hate. And at that point, I knew I was in Vietnam. I never saw such hate in my life on somebody's face.
For suspected communist agents, interrogation is brutal. Water poured on a cloth induces suffocation. In late 1966, more money is put into pacification. Suspect villages are promised amnesty.
My dear fellow citizens, we came here today to begin an operation aimed at clearing this area and mopping up the hidden Viet Cong, to bring security to all of you. We understand that among you there are some who have naively listened to the Viet Cong propaganda and have joined the rebels. Among them are some of your husbands, your brothers. So please advise them to come back. We are ready during this pacification program to admit them back to society and to assist them. You can help us.
One program is called County Fair.
We'll give him some cough syrup and some nose drops. This will take care of his cold, okay?
It combines military operations with medical care, food handouts, entertainment. From the beginning, Americans differ on the so-called Hearts and Minds program. Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge is optimistic. In 1965, Lodge foresees U.S. forces giving pacification a new push. Soon after, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara visits Vietnam. He calls pacification the key factor, but judges it a basic disappointment. He warns that extraordinary imagination and effort should go into changing the approach. A year after McNamara's warning, pacification is still failing. By now, 1 in 12 of South Vietnam's population are refugees. In 1967, the war widens. More and more North Vietnamese troops are involved, but American field commanders remain confident. The Americans largely contained the communist regulars to border areas. U.S. strategy relies on South Vietnamese forces to clear the countryside. But rebel forces are still successful against government troops. Thousands are taken prisoner. A quarter of the army deserts. 1 in 4 of the rebel weapons are captured American models. Government troops no longer move into the villages. The guerrillas boast of moving among the people like fish through water. They can now step up political indoctrination, the final phase of the communist war program. Medals are given to peasants who take up arms. By 1967, communist strength in the South is estimated at 300,000 men. Most of them Southerners. The communists have taken heavy casualties, but they now rest in safe havens and plan a wider war. The communists enlist the peasantry in distributing supplies from the north. By 1967, almost half the guerrilla weapons are Soviet and Chinese made. At this time, 100,000 North Vietnamese regulars infiltrate South. The Southern guerrillas provide a nationally organized supply and intelligence system. They are supremely confident. They are winning at the grassroots. Now, after 2 years of failure, President Johnson insists on a different approach. He gives control of pacification to a new civilian agency. Its director, Robert Comer.
We tried to design a system whereby we Americans could find out what was going on down at the hamlet level. We called it the Hamlet Evaluation System.
The U.S. evaluation, the communists control or influence 60% of the villages, far more than Saigon reports.
We didn't trust the Vietnamese reports. They were wildly exaggerated, so we tried to get the Americans to sort of keep tabs on the Vietnamese. We wrote, so to speak, the report cards for the district and province chiefs. And I think most people would agree that it was a very healthy corrective. At least we weren't corrupt. We may have been ignorant. We may not have understood a lot that was going on, but at least you could get more honest evaluations out of Americans than you could get out of Vietnamese, especially since they were working for a government in Saigon that did not want to hear bad news.
It is a new phase. Leaflets replace the bombs. They say that only communists want war. The new pacification agency is known as CORDS. It provides huge multi-purpose aid: wheat, miracle rice, pharmaceuticals, light bulbs, garbage trucks, sewing kits, machine tools, toothbrushes, and an atomic reactor. This economic aid costs $850 million, just 1/20th of the military cost. Comer claims success.
I would say that basically the 1967 program, which really didn't hit its stride until 1969 and 70, partly because it was critically interrupted by the Tet Offensive of '68, which just sort of set us back when we were barely getting going. But the fact of the matter is, and the more sophisticated members of the press saw and wrote about the same thing, that by 70, 71, we had really pacified most of the populated areas of South Vietnam. Now, that did not mean that a lot of fighting wasn't going on back in the boonies, as they called them. But essentially, most of the countryside was reasonably secure. The one thing that we had not been very successful at, as I mentioned before, was in rooting out the clandestine Viet Cong infrastructure, the enemy's control structure, which remained behind underground, and which we were very unsuccessful in getting at.
Now the policy is to fight a political battle. It becomes one of the most controversial programs of the war, Phoenix. The CIA director of Phoenix, William Colby.
The purpose was to centralize, in a central intelligence concept, all the knowledge that all the different intelligence agencies had about this structure, so that sensible action could be taken against it. Now, if this was the enemy command structure, obviously we wanted to know who they were, who its secret agents were, things of this nature, what kinds of programs they were conducting, not just the military units, but what kind of tax collecting, what kind of proselyting, what kind of kidnapping, things of this nature, what their terrorist programs were, and all the rest. To put agents into it, to get defectors out of it, to interrogate prisoners from it, and gradually to build up a knowledge of what this unit was.
An assessment of Phoenix from a CIA agent in Saigon, Frank Snepp.
It was supposed to generate intelligence, but the concept quickly became victim to practicalities. The first problem was that we really didn't know who a communist operative was. There was never a firm definition. Was a communist operative, a communist political agent, simply a water boy? Or was a political cadre someone who was a full-time communist? We never could figure out precisely whom we should be targeting. Then there was another problem. The PRU, the hit teams, were going out, arresting, pulling back to our interrogation centers a great many people. And the prisons quickly came to overflowing. To give you an idea of how the Phoenix program was targeted, I think I can conjure up an example. Let's say that a mafia chieftain was out to nail one of his opponents. He knew his opponent was having dinner in a particular restaurant in New York, and so he sends his hitmen in. The hitmen go in, they open up with a shotgun. They get the bartender, the bartender's son, a waiter. They also get the opposition figure, the target himself. Well, that's basically how the Phoenix program operated, except for the fact that, of course, it wasn't a bar or a restaurant that the hits took place in. It was a village or a hamlet.
If there was a fight outside the village at night, you went out in the morning and you found that, sure enough, people had been killed on both sides in that kind of a battle. Some on your side, some on the enemy side. When you identified who those were on the enemy side, sure enough, one of them was the head of the local guerrilla force. One of your leaders that had been on your list. Now, he hadn't been assassinated, he'd been killed.
William Colby testifies at congressional hearings called in 1971.
The Phoenix program was not a program of assassination. The Phoenix program was a part of the overall pacification program.
How many, roughly, would you estimate were eliminated?
Well, the elimination was all three categories because the word eliminate referred to the entire program against the apparatus.
Well, you can say kill them if you want.
We said killed. I believe that the figures in mid-71 that were testified to at that time were that some 28,000 had been captured, some 20,000 had been killed, and some 17,000 had actually rallied by that time.
In the end, America claimed success in the village war. But the conflict moves beyond the village to large-scale conventional warfare. By 1968, 1/3 of South Vietnam's 17 million population have been relocated. 1 million are still refugees by 1971. Millions more will be uprooted in the larger battles ahead. Once viewed as the key to the war, the people are now just in the way. For 12 years, under 3 presidents, the CIA's William Colby believes intelligence information is unheeded. He is critical of the reliance on military solutions. Colby first goes to Vietnam in 1959. He is sent again in 1968 to direct village pacification. He finds improvement.
Fact was, there were provinces in Vietnam, many of them. When I went to them in 1968, when I went back to Vietnam, I would go out 2 nights a week to go out in the country and spend the night someplace, talk to our people. In 68, I would have to go to a provincial capital, ringed with barbed wire, with tanks. You'd be mortared or rocketed during the night. When I went out in early 71, I could drive through the countryside in the night without any concern about safety in the same areas that had been so prohibited. Now, I think the problem was our bad perception of the nature of the war early on, and then our disgust with it, leading to our withdrawal from the military side of the equation at exactly the time the North Vietnamese turned to the pure military assault.
Until the 1968 Tet Offensive, the U.S. military directs the war. Though Tet shatters U.S. public confidence, it also shatters guerrilla strength, enabling American forces to gradually secure the villages. But with 1,000 Americans dying in combat each month, there's pressure to Vietnamize the war. Saigon's army, called ARVN, is unprepared. Conscription only now begins. And it's a race to improve training, equipment, and morale before the U.S. can announce plans to withdraw. The ARVN now numbers 427,000 men, still fewer than the U.S. force. But despite America's disillusionment, President Johnson and then President Nixon pledged full, ongoing support for Saigon. Johnson, while ending his own presidency, personally reassures President Thieu.
Mr. President, our pledge to help your people defeat aggression stands firm against all obstacles and against any deception.
We realized that even if President Johnson sent more troops to Vietnam, it's just to have a negotiated solution, not to win a military victory in the common sense.
Washington has initiated peace talks. Thieu's forces are told not to expect victory, but to show they can hold out. The U.S. only now begins to upgrade South Vietnam's outdated military machine. Saigon's Navy gets the latest PT boats to defend the Delta. For the first time, the ARVN gets the standard machine guns and rifles used by the U.S. forces. Saigon's troops are now on a more equal footing with Hanoi's Soviet-equipped army. With the weapons, the South Vietnamese soldiers get advanced training. Special paratroop and commando units are formed. The South Vietnamese Air Force builds to the 4th largest in the world. The United States military aid bill soars, and so do its hopes for reduced American involvement. January 1969, President Richard Nixon is inaugurated.
The greatest honor history can bestow is the title of peacemaker. This honor now beckons America, the chance to help lead the world at last out of the valley of turmoil and onto that high ground of peace that man has dreamed of since the dawn of civilization.
Nixon sees protests threatening an honorable exit. Defense Secretary Melvin Laird.
When I became Secretary of Defense in 1969, we had over 550,000 young men on the ground in Vietnam. We had Americanized the war. I made the decision, and I recommended to the Congress and to the President that we Vietnamize the war, we de-Americanize the war, that we get Americans out of Vietnam.
What do we want? Peace! When do we want it? Now! You want it, Tucker? What do we want? Peace! When do we want it? Now! Can't hear you! Peace! When do we want it? Now! What do we want?
Nixon now meets with President Thieu at Midway Island. He tells Thieu that the U.S. will immediately withdraw 25,000 troops. At first, Thieu objects strenuously, but gradually accepts the inevitable. The ceremonies at Midway are a changing of the guard.
We wish you well personally. More than that, the people of the United States wish your people well. We look forward to the day when they can live in peace together.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, thank you very much for your very comfortable words.
Thieu believes in Vietnamization. He later distrusts Nixon, but now supports him.
It's very useful. I would like to emphasize again, it's a constant duty of Vietnamese people to take over more responsibility and to alleviate the burden of the U.S. people to supporting us to defend the freedom in Vietnam.
Nixon has pledged to end the Vietnam War, but he has a greater priority, ending the Cold War. He believes an enforced settlement in Vietnam is a part of this wider goal. His security advisor, Henry Kissinger, calls Vietnam a sideshow. July 1969. Troop withdrawals begin. President Thieu is not yet alarmed.
Many times before, through many presidents of the United States, and also through President Nixon, they pledged time and again to help the Vietnamese people, the South Vietnamese people, in both economic aid and military aid, as long as they still need to fight communist invasion. So that's the reason why I trust them.
South Vietnamese forces increased to almost 500,000. Thieu is encouraged.
I think that the Vietnamization, if it's honestly done, it's fully done, it's a continuous one, it could be a way to prevent the collapse of South Vietnam.
The creation of a modern South Vietnamese army is a massive feat, but like the American forces, it does not hold the countryside. In Hanoi, too, it is a time of change. In September '69, Ho Chi Minh dies of a heart attack. Known as Uncle Ho, North Vietnam's founder and first president, is deeply mourned by the people he led for 25 years. Ho's legacy is a stable leadership. His earliest colleagues, military commander General Giap and Prime Minister Pham Van Dong, have been with him 30 years. Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin, attending the funeral, reaffirms the USSR's $1 billion a year aid. Communist Party chief Lê Duan takes overall command. He reads Ho Chi Minh's last will, an exhortation to fight until the last Yankee has gone. After Ho's death, North Vietnamese border infiltration reduces slightly as the North concentrates on domestic rebuilding. Though communist supplies and forces are still enough to enable a new offensive at any time, the trail is considered vulnerable to a ground attack. To protect the trail, the North Vietnamese establish base camps inside Laos. These are the target of Operation Lam Son, the 1971 South Vietnamese invasion. War returns to Kaise. The abandoned base, scene of bloody combat in 1968, is reactivated. This will be the first test of Vietnamization. Success will give much-needed confidence to the South Vietnamese forces. The Americans will provide only supply planes and air cover as an elite South Vietnamese infantry division invades southern Laos. The objective, to sever communist supply routes. North Vietnamese war material reaches South Vietnam through Laos along the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail. Heavy guns and large troop contingents are able to move 50 miles a day. The North Vietnamese are sending more troops south than the U.S. is withdrawing. This jeopardizes America's plan to turn the war over to South Vietnam. The Laos invasion has 4 phases. First, a 10,000-man U.S. force will take up artillery support positions at the border. Next, 17,000 South Vietnamese troops will advance on the crossroads town of Chep Pong. Third, the destruction of communist bases. The final phase is withdrawal. President Nguyen Van Thieu.
We said that on a limited time, we have to do our best in the Ho Chi Minh Trail to try our best to destroy as much as possible the logistic compound of the North Vietnamese communists along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, so we can delay the offensive. They have a plan for the northern province of Vietnam, and they to reduce the war potential of North Vietnamese throughout the South Vietnam.
But preparations cannot be kept secret. The U.S. High Command is divided. State Department officials claim that South Vietnamese forces are too few and inexperienced, but the military supports the invasion. February 8th, ARVN troops start moving toward Laos. The communists quickly and easily reinforce. The ability to mass so many troops so quickly is a surprise to the American and Vietnamese High Command. The South Vietnamese army is unaware it is surrounded and outnumbered 2 to 1. The going at first is easy, deceptively so. But former Premier Nguyen Cao Ky says the mission is not aggressive enough.
I was up there to inspect the field with my wife. And in the very first days of invasion, and the way that they carried the plan, I already, if you remember well, I already said it will be a failure. And Mr. Thieu at that time blamed me that I am wrongly criticized. If you decide to go there to stop their supply line, and you have to go there and stay there.
If we go to Chepon, even though we know that we cannot stay longer, but it's a point of honor to show to the communists that we can go to Chepon and stay there even one day and go back.
On the eve of battle, the U.S. military still supports the action. But Secretary of State Kissinger later describes it as conceived in doubt and confusion. Using U.S. helicopters, 17,000 troops vault into Laos. Inside Laos, the operation stalls. Beyond the ARVN artillery fire, the North Vietnamese are in control. Earlier U.S. plans to attack the trail called for at least 60,000 troops. By this estimate, South Vietnam's invading force is only 1/3 what it should be. The battle escalates, tanks against artillery. American gunners inside South Vietnam increase their fire. Communist artillery responds in a long-range duel. The main South Vietnamese target is just 25 miles inside Laos, but after 3 weeks, they're still only halfway there. The U.S. sends fighter bombers, but communist air defense is far tougher than anticipated. Communist troops move closer to the South Vietnamese positions, preventing widespread airstrikes. Troop helicopters take the heaviest losses. 100 are shot down. 176 Americans are killed. After 4 weeks, the ARVN troops reached the town of Chepon, but again faced unexpected fire from Soviet ground rockets. The invaders retreat. Communist supply camps, the initial objective of the operation, are untouched. The North Vietnamese counterattack. Some South Vietnamese units are annihilated. The U.S. military criticizes ARVN for not holding, but President Thieu accuses the Americans of being the first to back off.
Now, what went wrong is that after the first week of operation, as the Americans have suffered many casualties on helicopter pilots, and they reduce most totally the number of helicopter used for the medical evacuation. That's the reason why the Vietnamese troops cannot advance further, because they have to take care of the wounded, the dead, and that slow down the advance of Vietnamese troops deeper in Laotian territory, and that give advantage to the North Vietnamese troops to react.
The Lam Son operations was a failure because of planning, because the operation itself was unnecessary. If you send your troops to make an enclave to draw the communist troops and then destroy them, yes. But just to go there, in that jungle area for a promenade, what for? What for?
The failure in Laos severely damages the military command structure. Many of the best officers are captured or killed. Although the Saigon government holds a victory parade, both Nixon and Thieu now doubt the ability of South Vietnam to fight the war alone. The Pentagon says it has done what it can for South Vietnam. Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird.
You can give them the training and the equipment so that they can use their manpower. If they do not use it effectively, that is something that you cannot ensure through any kind of military activity.
The American used the Vietnamization, the so-called Vietnamization program, as a pretext to withdraw the troops, to scatter and run, and to abandon the South Vietnamese people alone, and to be overrun later by the North Vietnamese communists with a certain time after that. That's the so-called the decent interval.
America continues its troop withdrawal, but in April 1972, a major communist offensive overruns the northern province. But by July, only 45,000 Americans remain. The farewells are formality. South Vietnam is alone and bitter.
At that time, the Americans would like to end the war as fast as possible, to wash their hands, to quit the Vietnam for the domestic problem in United States, and that's their policy from the time they began to withdraw the troops and to pull out from Vietnam. I think it's not an error in politics, not an error. It's a deliberate, wrong politic, but deliberate.
We went to Vietnam not to destroy freedom, but to defend it. We went to Vietnam not as an aggressor, but to stop aggression. And history will record that the American effort in Vietnam was a good cause, honorably undertaken and honorably ended.
Nixon and Thieu have a final meeting in April 1973, soon after the signing of a peace agreement with Hanoi. Thieu claims his army cannot hold without massive American aid. Nixon reassures him that America will always aid South Vietnam. But within 18 months, Nixon will have resigned. In 2 years, the war will be over. South Vietnam obtains the most sophisticated weaponry in Asia. This is part of a special $1 billion military aid program called Operation Antz. It comes just before the signing of the Paris Peace Accords. But without future replacements, the new array of jets, tanks, and guns will be useless. President Thieu's Minister of Economic Development, Nguyen Thien Hung.
Vietnamization has very serious flaws. First, that it did not cope with the reality of Vietnam. Shall I say that Vietnamization was carried out the American way, Americanized Vietnamization. You know, the forces were trained, were equipped just like a regular U.S. division with tanks, artillery, helicopters, so on. Which means that you reinforce the South Vietnamese dependence on American supply.
American doubts are reinforced by misuse of facilities. Scores of former American camps are supposed to be used by the Vietnamese military, but many camps are looted. A base at Tay Ninh near Saigon. A few weeks after the Americans leave, even the supports have been removed. The trappings, furniture, and fittings go first. Then walls, roofs, and floors vanish. A symbolic sign remains. Goodbye and good luck.